Prime Minister Mark Carney is bracing Canadians for his first budget. Speaking last night here in Ottawa, Carney promised unprecedented investments in Canada's economy.
Well, we're now just 2 weeks away from the federal government's first budget, and while we do not know what will be in that document yet, we did hear from the Prime Minister this evening, Mark Carney setting the stage.
Yeah, Adrian, at that press conference, Carney warned Trump that if there isn't progress on trade talks to get sectors hit by his tariff some relief, that Canada will do what's necessary.
Tonight in Ottawa, something just snapped into place. A small movement of a pen that may have shifted an entire continent. This wasn't a routine budget night. It wasn't another cautious speech about deficits and forecasts. It felt like the end of one story and the opening line of another. In a packed press theater inside Parliament Hill, with cameras humming and screens glowing, Prime Minister Mark Carney stepped up to a podium and quietly did what no Canadian leader has dared to do in decades. He declared that Canada's economic future will no longer orbit around Washington. No shouting, no drama, no anger, just a calm, deliberate statement that landed like a fault line finally giving way. For nearly half a century, Canada's prosperity has been framed as a derivative of American success. Trade agreements, cross-border supply chains, joint projects, integrated markets, all the familiar phrases that made it sound like tying your fate to a superpower was the only rational choice. That era, Carney said, is finished. Not paused, not renegotiated, finished. The world has become more fragmented and more dangerous, he told the room, his voice steady but unmistakably firm. And Canada will no longer build its future on the assumption that Washington will always do the right thing. You could feel the air shift. The official excuse for the evening was a budget. The reality was a strategic declaration. Carney didn't just present spending lines. He unveiled a structural redesign of how Canada will function in the next decade, how it builds homes, powers its cities, arms its military, and funds its industries, all with one central objective: reduce dependence on the United States to the point where American politics is no longer an existential risk. It started innocently enough with a housing plan. He called it the Homes for Canada Initiative, but the details made it clear this was something more than a domestic program. A new federal builder, partnering with provinces, municipalities, and indigenous nations, would use idle public land, new prefabrication plants, and bulk purchasing of materials to slash construction time and cut costs, targeting hundreds of thousands of units over the next few years. On paper, housing. In practice, an industrial engine, because every component, from lumber to windows to insulation to heat pumps, would be sourced from Canadian companies wherever possible. New factories in Atlantic Canada, the prairies, and the north. New fabrication hubs linked by rail. New research incentives for low-carbon materials. Housing was not just shelter. It was the scaffold for a self-contained manufacturing and supply chain network. Then came the second piece, a sweeping Made in Canada First rule. Going forward, all federal procurement, from infrastructure to defense to transit to clean energy, will default to Canadian suppliers. Not as a polite preference, not as a tiebreaker, but as the starting condition. Foreign bids would be allowed only when domestic capacity genuinely does not exist. That may sound technical, it isn't. For decades, U.S. multinationals have dominated Canadian public contracts, winning tenders, extracting profit, and leaving control elsewhere. Tonight, Carney flipped that on its head. The message between the lines was clear. If America wants access to Canadian projects, it will have to compete on Canada's terms, not assume them. But the real pivot was geopolitical. Carney made something explicit that had only been whispered in policy circles. U.S. unpredictability is now a strategic threat. Every tariff tantrum, every trade war, every election that could flip policy overnight, those are no longer external shocks. They are recurring features of American politics. And building your economy on them, he argued, has become reckless. So Canada will hedge, not by retreating, but by expanding. New long-term export frameworks with Europe and Asia, accelerated trade corridors through the Arctic and the Atlantic, a renewed emphasis on deepening ties with Mexico, South Korea, Japan, and key African partners. Critical minerals, once shipped raw to the U.S., will now be refined and processed domestically wherever possible, or within allied networks that don't treat trade as a weapon. Reliance, Carney said, is not the same as partnership. It was an ice-cold sentence wrapped in polite delivery. The most striking moment came when a reporter asked about the forestry sector in New Brunswick. heavily dependent on U.S. demand and currently squeezed by American restrictions. It was the perfect opportunity to complain about Washington. Instead, Carney calmly laid out a three-step plan: ramp up domestic use through federal procurement, retool plants to produce higher-value products, and open new markets in Europe and Asia using existing trade deals. Not once did he frame the province's fate as something that required American permission. Then he said the line that crystallized his approach: "We will negotiate with the United States when it's useful, but we will not wait on the United States to act." In that sentence, you could hear an entire foreign policy doctrine turning. He didn't deny that the U.S. is still Canada's most important trading partner. He didn't slam Washington. He didn't mention any president by name. What he did instead was something far more consequential. He made the emotional break, the psychological one, the break where a country shifts from "what will they do" to "what will we do?" That's what makes tonight seismic. The budget numbers themselves were massive. $1 trillion, decade-long commitment to housing, clean power, transportation, digital infrastructure, AI, and domestic manufacturing. Not a one-off stimulus package, a structural reinvestment, a rebuild from the inside out. In his closing minutes, Carney turned from numbers to narrative. He spoke about the long arc of Canadian history, Indigenous trade networks stretching across the continent, early fur routes linking oceans, a country that has repeatedly reinvented itself after global shocks. Not as nostalgic ornament, but as context. "Canada has never been just a branch plant," he said. "We have always had the capacity to chart our own path. Tonight is about finally using it." Then, almost offhand, he added, "These are decisions that don't require anyone's permission. Not now, not ever." No flourish, no raised voice, just a quiet statement of fact. And that's where the true power of tonight lies. Trump's politics, and the broader American trend toward weaponized trade, are built on the assumption that everyone else is trapped. Too dependent, too exposed, too afraid to move. For years, that assumption held. Tonight, Canada stepped aside. This isn't the end of U.S.-Canada trade. It's not a breakup. It's a recalibration, a recognition that partnership only works when both sides have the freedom to walk away from a bad deal without collapsing. Carney didn't come to fight Washington. He came to free Ottawa from waiting for Washington. And if his plan works, it won't just be about Canada. Other countries watching closely, Europe, Asia, the Global South, may see a template for how to live alongside a volatile superpower without surrendering national agency. One press conference, one budget, one quiet revolution. Canada didn't slam the door tonight. It simply built another exit. And that, in geopolitics, is how power really shifts. What do you think? Is Carney overreaching, or is this the reset Canada needed years ago? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to follow how this plays out, how Washington reacts, how markets respond, and whether other countries follow, make sure you're subscribed. Because this story isn't over. It's just getting started.